Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar, Leading Through Communication in Times of Crisis. I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker today, Rick J. Kaufman, APR. Rick is the Executive Director of Community Relations and Emergency Management for Bloomington Public Schools in Minnesota and is a nationally respected crisis management consultant, trainer, and author of the Complete Crisis Communication Management Manual for Schools. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rick.
Thank you, Ria. And thank you to Peachjar for hosting this. Good morning to some, good afternoon to others. Thank you for taking time out of your day to participate in this Leading Through Communication in Times of Crisis, the Peachjar webinar. I think hopefully you walk away with a lot of information. And I want to thank Peachjar again for hosting this. In my district, Bloomington Public Schools, we do use Peachjar. We love it. It was actually brought to us by a group of parents that really wanted to see a reduction in the amount of emails and flyers that were going home. And so in our process of vetting, we found Peachjar, and they've been just an absolute great partner of ours and very friendly to our parents. We continue to get great feedback. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the area that I'm sorry, probably seeing something different here. Okay, here we go. What you will learn today, we're going to be talking about why crisis communication is so important, key elements of a crisis communications plan. And this is one of the more important things that we often, when we do crisis communication training, we talk only about what it is we should be communicating in a crisis. And I think it's like anything we do in school public relations communications, we have to have a plan. So I'll go through some fundamentals of a solid crisis communication plan. Then we will talk about those best practices for communicating in a crisis and a social media plan within your crisis communications plan. We obviously in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years have seen the growth and the incredible power of social media, and especially when it comes to crisis. And so we'll talk about that, including those protocols when it hits the fan. For those of you that are so inclined that would like to tweet out your participation today or anything you learn, we invite you to use the hashtag CrisisCommPlan. And I also want to remind you that if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat and the answer box that's on your screen to put your question in, and we'll have time built in at the end of the workshop today for us to cover those questions as much as we can. Also, this presentation is going to be available after we get done today, and Peachjar will take care of that, so you will have an opportunity to download it. There's a lot of material in this presentation, and we won't cover everything on every slide. And I always do that disclaimer to let you know that some of it's going to be pretty self-explanatory, and in others, we just don't have the time to go into so much depth in all those pieces. But I want you to have it, so if you do have questions or you want to follow up after this session with me, you are welcome to do that as well. So you never want to be in this position. This happens to be the photograph of the day after the Columbine tragedy on April 20th, 1999. What we came to on that day and then the days following that was the sort of a media center that came to be after the tragedy. This was within several hundred feet of the school. It became a natural spot because this is a large community park where all of the TV stations and broadcast media and newsprint media assembled on a daily basis. And you can see from the photograph that there were more of them than there were of us. And thus started our efforts to communicate with our stakeholders and with our community and the greater Denver metro area, as well as the world, on that tragedy. What we learned that day and have since is that communication is the foundation of any crisis planning, implementation, management, and recovery effort. In essence, it covers all of the facets of emergency or crisis management, and it is a vital and critical aspect of the work that you will do in managing a crisis. The way we look at it is that if the top priority in a crisis is public safety, then the top objective for crisis communication really should be to prevent harm to your stakeholders. And the worst time to let your stakeholders know what happened is when that emergency is going on. You really need to let your stakeholders know ahead of time what you will do and how you will communicate with them in an emergency long before it happens. Because in as much as you and your world will change throughout the crisis, so too are your stakeholders, especially if they have a vested interest in the sense of they have a child or a family member that's working for your organization. We also know that it's no longer about us just communicating to our public. We know that on an everyday basis, but it is as critical during a crisis, because what you're doing is you're communicating with your stakeholders. You want to engage, believe it or not, your stakeholders in a crisis to create better understanding, support, and at the end of all of this, for that support to continue to be there. And how you manage that crisis, and more importantly, how you communicate during the crisis, really is one of the most important aspects of your organization's reputation, not to mention yours and your leadership. When we have a crisis, though, it creates a heck of an information void. And as a public, we abhor the vacuum that's often created by that. The lack of information, the short decision time equals a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And when that happens, we tend to want to look for information. And the reason is we want to gain a sense of a personal control over that situation. What was amazing to me working at Columbine during that time, on that day and in the subsequent days after, and in the many of the tragedies that have advised on or consulted school systems across the country, is that people want to touch the tragedy in some way, shape, or form. And as I've studied that over the last nearly 20 years, what I've come to find is that there's a sense of wanting control over that situation because it has upset our equilibrium. It has really put us in a sense of an unknowing, a really anxious feeling, somewhat stressful. And the closer we are to that incident, the more that it impacts us. And certainly for those of your stakeholders, it's very close. And so their sense of that personal control will be more profound. What we mean by that is we are motivated to reduce the uncertainty. And so we go into this search for a lot of information. And when we can't find it, that void is created. And if we aren't the ones that are filling that void for our stakeholders, someone else is going to. And it's typically going to be someone that's ill-informed, misinformed, or in some cases motivated to harm the system or what I believe is your organization. Kind of the trolls out there that may have an axe to grind or are upset with your organization. So why is crisis communication so important? Well, people remember how a crisis is handled longer than the details of the incident itself. Thus, long-term damage to your organization is done often more so before and after a crisis than actually during it. So it's important that trust and credibility is established very quickly, because if you don't, it can be permanently lost, or it will take a very long time to rebuild the trust and the social capital you have in your community. How we do that is that proactive crisis communication, because it minimizes the damage as well as improves your morale and truly does encourage healing of your organization. And for those of you that have dealt with any sort of crisis, you probably have seen that. Yesterday, sadly, in our district, we learned of an employee that had taken his own life over the weekend. He was a very well-known employee in the district, and it happened to be at our district office, which is housed in a middle school. So we were sort of impacted in lots of ways, and how we manage that, even though that's more internal than external, is really important, because it did entail communication, not only to our staff members most affected, but the district at large, because this employee touched all of our schools through his work. In addition, our news media, even though it has significantly changed, it continues to help set not only your area, but regional, sometimes even world agendas. So keep in mind that the news media continue to have significant long-term impact on the public perception as well as your organizational reputation. So let's talk a little bit about the communications plan. It has to be very detailed, but simple. And it's a plan that's really important that you have, because without it, you will be operating sort of a rudderless. If you've ever been in a boat that you sort of lose power, you're left to the mercy of the wind, the waves, and the current. That often happens when you're dealing in a crisis and you don't have a plan. That plan really is, how are you as an organization going to communicate not only during but after the crisis itself? There also has to be criterion there as who activates that plan and what are the incidents that trigger the plan. More importantly, who is the person that's sort of going to oversee it. The key functions of that plan should really address how you will and how you are communicating internally and externally to those stakeholders. Who is responsible for what? Even though some of you out there, or many of you out there, may be a one-person PR shop, there's a responsibility that can be shared. And part of that planning needs to take place, if you haven't done that already, to incorporate and or reach out to those individuals that can assist you, whether they're within your office structure or your organization, or they may be through your state chapter or even a national chapter, depending on the magnitude of the crisis you're dealing with and the help that's needed. Your plan should also identify not only the communication channels and mediums, whether it's email, voicemail, social media and media, broadcast media, your website, even whether you'll have a media or press, the more traditional press conferences. Outlining all of those pieces are critically important to the plan, and it helps you when you get sort of into the fire, that you have a tool that you can rely on to get you through that crisis. It also works very well, is valuable to be able to show your leader, whether it's a superintendent or assistant superintendent or any other person within your department or organization, that you have a plan that's going to be driven by the things that you do. Throughout this presentation today or webinar, I'll give you some tips along the way. The tip on this one is, if you wait until the crisis to create a plan, you're too late. Reminds me of my superintendent, who often will chide the cabinet that if we're on time to a meeting, we're already late. The plan should also then outline the communications team. This is probably the most important piece of your plan. Really what you're going to be doing is collecting info, creating and disseminating key messages. You will be working with the media in 9 times out of 10, the situation. And you'll need to monitor the response to not only the crisis, but also your messages. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The roles as well as your team makeup can consist or should consist of any number of these, individually or collectively. Obviously, a spokesperson. Who is the person that's going to be assigned to address the crisis and deliver those key messages through whatever mediums and channels? A much larger incident will sometimes require what I call an air traffic controller. Someone that is going to process those requests for interviews and information that'll come in by the bucket loads. A much larger crisis, a magnitude of on the scale of a Columbine or Parkland, Florida, you'll need this person to help in managing the flow or the informational requests and for interviews that are coming in. As I noted, you'll have and should have a social media plan, and we'll cover that in a few minutes. The other piece to this is what I call a tracker. It is important to monitor the media, online conversations, to gauge the opinion out of your stakeholders and in some respects the broader public. This is important for organizational reputation, as well as, are your messages really truly meeting the needs of your stakeholders, not just what the media is putting out there. And a gatekeeper, and is often going to fall to you as this person who has that final approval for the key messages that are going out, or is that outlined in the plan's procedures. Reminds me of the time when I volunteered and became a member of the emergency response team to Hurricane Katrina, working with FEMA as an information specialist. overseeing all of the public information officers that were assigned to the most hardest hit parishes after the hurricane, and the information that they were providing and how we were getting that out. It had to go through 7 bureaucratic channels going up the chain and coming back down before it could be disseminated. You can imagine what that looked like, and by the time it did get disseminated, it was a story that was much too old for the media. They had all that they needed. Communicating during a response involves response statements, key messages, the who, what, where, and the when. And notice I didn't say the why. We should never be in the business of trying to determine why something happened, as opposed to more about what happened, where, when, and who is really those students and their staff that are most effective. We're going to talk about the no comment, the apologies, and what I believe to be one of the most important pieces, and that is always with the victims and victims' families at the forefront of all that we think and do during a crisis. Victims and victims' families are not just those who may have perished as a result of the tragedy, but those who have survived and lived through it, those that are greatest impacted by the crisis. You can't ignore your employees is another tip. Sharing the response and the action steps throughout your process is critical. Your employees are your ambassadors. They're the individuals that will help to carry the message. Sometimes employees that are left in the dark can be your greatest nightmare because it starts the rumor mill. And we experienced that yesterday before we had a confirmation of our employee who had passed away. Some of the rumors that got started and our need to make sure that all employees were aware of the situation. Also, try to avoid the tendency to justify your organization's actions. We have a tendency sometimes to be, as an organization, to go on the defensive. And when you're dealing in a crisis, the worst tactic you can do is to try to go on the defensive immediately or justify your actions. One only needs to do a case study on the ExxonMobil oil spill in Alaska, or even BP, the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, to see how, when they tried to justify their actions, how well that played out in the public. When the crisis is over, at least the immediacy of it, it really is not for you or your team. It is then when, even though we're tired, worn out, and believe that we can do a collective sigh of relief, we're really in the post-crisis analysis time. We need to debrief, what some of us call hot wash. We need to ask the questions: what worked in our process? What didn't work? What were our greatest challenges that we faced with respect to that crisis and the key messages that were out there? Sort of want to go back to that, the trackers role as they gauge the public opinion, our stakeholders. We also must identify that what it is we must improve from our action steps, and then what we must revise with respect to our plan. Crisis communications plans, like many communications plans, are very fluid and thus need to be revised, and that's the best time to do is as we look at our work after an incident. Continue to maintain the pulse of your organization and prepare for those trigger events or even the anniversary dates. They are like a mini crisis. It's just a regurgitation of the crisis that you've already dealt with. Parkland, Florida is a good example of a trigger event for school systems that have dealt with traumatic events, and anniversary dates are pretty self-explanatory. I want to mention a couple resources. I'm often asked is, who are your greatest go-to in terms of persons or in terms of resource material? And there's 3 books that I believe provide us some of the best insights in terms of crisis communication. And they're listed on your screen here. Ongoing Crisis Communication by Timothy Coombs is a very quick read and pretty down and dirty. One of my go-to persons, he also happens to be a neighbor of mine, is Jim Lukashevsky. And his book, Lukashevsky on Crisis Communication, is really the Bible for me in terms of crisis communications and really addressing the focus on victims and victims' families. Another really good book by Jonathan Bernstein is The Manager's Guide to Crisis Management. While it is more reflective of crisis management in general, Jonathan goes into great detail about crisis communications. And then a new online course that I'm really excited about is David Voss and I have created a crisis readiness online course. It's a 3-hour course that delves specifically into developing a crisis communications plan. More information will be forthcoming on that. I hope you'll look for that. So in crisis communication, it comes down to these 5 C's: the concern and empathy. Now we're out of the plan stage, we're in the actual doing stage. This is really simply showing your human side and keeping those victims in the forefront of all that you say and do. Clarity of your message, is it cohesive? Is it a message written for your stakeholders, not written for what you believe it should be? Control is taking charge to act and communicate swiftly, but not taking charge in the sense of not listening to your stakeholders, not listening to gauging that public opinion. Confidence is don't be complacent or too aggressive. It's important to have confidence in what you say and do, but over complacency or aggressiveness can sometimes put you in hot water. And then competence, just do the job well. When it comes to crisis communication, it is about two-way dialogue. We can't rely on any one source for sharing information. It's really a forum for discussion about the incident. And one-way messaging doesn't work. As I noted before, your stakeholders want to be engaged. They want to discuss the crisis. They want to be in the know. Know that in the first few minutes, bad news spreads faster. So it's really important at this time. It's not about waiting to get information out. It's about getting information as much as you know out to your stakeholders. This is where you want to be monitoring all that relevant consumer media that's out there. And while it can be taxing on staff and time, it's important to know how your stakeholders or what your stakeholders are getting in terms of information from other sources. And know that in some respects, depending on the size and magnitude of your crisis, it could be a 24-hour-a-day operation. What resources do you have in mind or in place to handle that kind of incident? When it comes to crisis communication, silence is not golden. This is nothing new for well-seasoned school public relations professionals. There's no such thing as no comment. And by staying silent, we will not only reflect uncertainty and passivity, but it suggests you're not in control or not trying to take control. Remember, control is important to credibility. And if you remain silent, it's far much worse than responding in a crisis. So it's about minutes, not hours, that has a direct likelihood to the success of managing that crisis. In speed of communications, that first impressions are lasting impressions. So you need to try to be first with the framing of the incident. Again, the who, what, where, and the when. If you don't, others are going to tell your story. But get it right. Repeat it and share it with others, remembering to include your employees, your colleagues within your organization first. They're often the best defense against inaccurate employee comments and can refute rumors or that insatiable grapevine that often gets started. And as I noted earlier, it's important to sustain that trust and credibility during and after the crisis. Now, a few minutes ago, I talked about thinking of your stakeholders and not necessarily communicating to what you want to get out there. While that's an important element, the other is what we consider as perspective taking. An essential element of crisis communication is perspective taking. And really what that means is the ability to view the crisis from your stakeholders' point of view, especially those who are victims. If we only communicate what we believe our public wants to hear, we are not fully communicating what and what the information is that they are looking for. When we get caught up in what we're trying to communicate and not thinking what is most important to our stakeholders, we tend to lose the support of our stakeholders, that social capital that I spoke about. One of the most important things you can do, at least initially, is develop those response statements. These are nothing more than pre-developed communications key messages that are fact-based positions for your stakeholders and public in the wake of an incident. They're your first opportunity to shape the message. There are lots of different definitions for response statements. Some used to call them holding statements, or they're statements that are on your dark website or ghost website in the event you have a crisis. It is really just being prepared to have a statement that's brief and simple. The what, where, when, and who's involved. Confirm that incident, but you're holding on details because often you don't have the details. Sharing priorities and action steps. Your public wants to know, your stakeholders want to know what you're doing about it. And so who's involved, who's responding to that incident? Reassure your stakeholders. The reassurance comes with information that's provided very efficiently, effectively, and with credible information about what's happening and who's responding. Your public is at that stage in the crisis that they need to know that you are on top of it and you're responding. And then in many cases, what are you doing for parents that will likely want to respond to their child's school that's in crisis? How or where should they go? How should they respond? It's easy to say, parents, stay where you are, but we know based on studies and actual, if you've dealt with a crisis where that happens, you know parents are going to show up. So an initial statement really should be, we understand an incident has occurred. Authorities are responding. We don't have any confirmation of injuries at this time. That provides that who, what, where, and when, and reassures parents and stakeholders with the limited information that you will likely have. When you can, provide priorities or action steps, such as our campus is in lockdown. Students and faculty are following established safety procedures, or we've evacuated and students and staff are safe. Anytime you can underscore the condition of your students and staff will go a long way to reducing the anxiety and fear and stress level of not only your stakeholders, but also your employees or colleagues within the organization, neighboring schools across town, if you will. And reassurance. We're working with law enforcement too. We will provide more information as it becomes available. You're planting the seed that you are on top of it, you're managing it, and when more information becomes available, you'll do so. In some respects, you may need to give a time frame for that. We'll come back with you in an hour, or we'll come back to you in 15 more minutes. Try not to tie yourself down, but sometimes when it comes to the media, having a specific time is very important, knowing that you're going to come back with information. Response statements, the concise statement, it can be used for a variety of audiences and mediums. In other words, instead of trying to create a new message for each one of your mediums, use the same ones for your Twitter or website, your talking points, whatever you may be posting on social media. If you have the ability to start developing a list of frequently asked questions based on what can be anticipated from your media or stakeholders, it's a good opportunity to do that and then plant that in that ghost website, or if you don't have a ghost website, if you've now sort of commandeered your website, driving people to a place, they can get those kinds of questions. Some of you have been in my workshops where we've sort of done this using Twitter as a live scenario, what that looks like in types of questions that can be asked, or how your parents may respond, or a community troll, or someone from the media. It's a great test to how you can be prepared for the kinds of questions that will come in. And remember, those sincere statements should convey understanding, sympathy, and in some cases, offers condolences and an apology, and we'll talk about an apology here shortly. Remember that people will remember long after the incident whether your organization's heart was in the right place. So how do we feel about apologies in our response statements or other crisis response messaging? When I do workshops with school districts, or whether it's been through state associations or even NSFRA, this question is one that elicits a lot of responses. And it's important to think about apologies and what they mean for our organizations. And I would offer up to you or suggest is a great tabletop discussion within your organization at the cabinet level. If we are to have a crisis, what do we feel about apologies? I've compiled for you on this slide some of the reasons why apologies are a good thing and why they should be strongly considered and put in use depending on the situation. Even though it may cause some heartburn for your legal counsel and lots of headaches, consider that the use of apologies, while it may create issues from a legal perspective, they can be both important and effective in your response to the incident you're dealing with. It is a sense of transparency, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to fall on the sword or being overly extreme. Conversely, admitting wrongdoing can help your cause in both the courts of law and public opinion. And thus because it's such a really an interesting and somewhat controversial subject internally, you have to consider the interest that must be weighed. Think about credibility with the legal safeguard in mind. After response statements, when you're dealing with a crisis, comes those frequent updates. They help to inform your stakeholders the progress of the response. And progress can be even, or should be even, after the crisis, because those updates are, how is the recovery effort progressing? In some cases, the cause of the crisis, depending on what the incident is, may be one of those frequent updates. For example, if you were to have a boiler that goes out and created a lot of smoke or sent the school scurrying in evacuation. Sometimes the cause of the crisis is important. Stay away from those causes that are just left up to subjectivity, where we really don't know why someone did what they did. And those ongoing actions you're taking to prevent a repeat, including when changes are going to be implemented, if they're going to be implemented. It's always a good thing to report any third-party support or those outside groups that are praising your response or your recovery efforts. We had an incident a couple of years ago on a middle school field trip where a number of students on an orienteering exercise came upon the body of a young person that had committed suicide in a nature preserve. And the work that we did in handling that crisis led to the National Alliance on Mental Illness praising us for not only our quick actions to provide grief counseling in the wake of that, but went on to outline the steps that we did. And that was a public praise that really helped within our organization and our community and how we handled that very public incident. Now let's talk about social media before we sort of end this and get into the Q&A part of that. It's important that when you maintain a robust crisis communication strategy, that you also have integrated social media into your crisis management plan. If you don't, and there may be districts out there that really have yet to embrace social media, and if you're listening, it is important you consider this in your organization, because it is another tool, if you are one to be an advocate for it, for dealing for your crisis communications plan. We all know that it's audience driven, it's ushered in the transparency revolution, but it really has changed our stakeholders' expectation for not only how we share information on a daily or probably multiple times a day, but also how we engage them in crisis. And it does go a long way towards building the distrust of your stakeholders. So why should we embrace social media in use in a crisis communication? Because it's really important. It increases your communications to your stakeholders. It really targets your influential key communicators, or what I call FIRs. So what's a FIR? A FIR is a first information responder. They play a key role in disseminating news of the crisis to their inner circle of friends, neighbors, and family. Think of yourself as a FIR. If at one time not your organization, but you were aware of an incident and you told a friend or neighbor, or that incident caused you to want to get as much information as you could, and then you shared that with others, you became a first information responder. It works the same way in your organization. They could be your parents, they could be someone that runs a neighborhood Facebook page where it's a sort of a garage sale of people dumping in information. A first information responder is actually a friend. They tend to believe the organization's information is credible. And so they are a key communicator in many respects. They are often viewed as not only knowledgeable, but credible by their interpersonal networks, their friends, their neighbors, their family, their grapevine network. So in times of crisis, they often become our ambassadors. And their interpersonal networks then are sources that are most sought after for the information in an emergency. So think of it this way. If a FIR, that key communicator, has information that you've provided and they've already believed that's credible, they in turn share that and become an ambassador for that organization in a roundabout way. And then their interpersonal networks, they have the credibility. So they, as they're sharing that information, you sort of have created this network of first information responders or credibility among your key stakeholders. I challenge you to Google first information responders for more in-depth information about it. So let's go back. Why else should we embrace social media? Well, it establishes a situational awareness, and as we've noted several times, it does quickly fill that information void. Listening, in other words, the social media monitoring, informs smart doing. So when we talked about that tracker, the person that kind of tracks media and the conversations that are not only on social media, but traditional media, print reports, or they're following the kind of the talking heads, it translates to us being more informed and better at how we respond as that crisis or that incident continues to unfold. Remember that your public is embracing these new technologies, and so they are communicating, we better too. We can't put our heads in the sand. When you have a social media plan within your crisis communication plan, there are a couple protocols that are really important. It is important that you cease normal operations. We all, or many of us that have our so very robust social media operationally every day, we schedule or automate the content of what we're going to have to go out that day. If you have a crisis, you need to delete those pre-scheduled or automated content because you want to kind of hijack your own social media sites so that you have the field to be able to share the content that you want as your official on the record statement. Acknowledge the situation very quickly. You're the most relevant in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. The quicker you are with that information, with that, the better you are in building support in those ambassadors as well as the social capital. You have to prepare to address those vulnerabilities. There's going to be scrutiny, there's going to be unwanted attention. Be careful not to get so bogged down into the need to respond to every one of those trolls or those that are very ill-informed or wish to do you damage, that you lose sight of the other more important efforts to communicate and focus on your stakeholders. Find that right balance. Don't join in those conversations if you don't belong, and only post new, relevant, and timely information. I've seen it time and again, often when I'm called to advise or consult, where the organization wants to get into a tussle with people that are posting things on their social media sites. And it's important that you stay away from that and not defensive. Correct, but don't delete. Deleting information and your account will be viewed as suspect, that you're trying to not only silence your stakeholders, whether they're supportive or not, but more importantly, you're trying to hide something, and thus you'll hurt your credibility and reputation. When you lose that, it takes a very long time to get that back. While social media provides a whole new set of challenges and opportunities, the fundamentals of crisis communication doesn't change. So it's really important that you continue to stay focused on responding to your stakeholders at the onset of the crisis as quickly and as efficiently as you can. Commit to open, credible, ongoing two-way dialogue. And then listen to the concerns of your stakeholders and place them over your own interests. That's easier said than done. Granted, it's very difficult, but it is also very important. Be accountable before your public demands accountability. Don't hide behind an incident if it's something that you have to take ownership for, or that you may believe that your actions may have led to that. And this is where you really need legal counsel's assistance in guiding you through that. But don't shy away from, at that table, those hard conversations, because again, the court of public law and the court of public opinion are two very different but very important stakeholders when you have an incident you're dealing with. Be accessible, also flexible and adaptable. Be authentic and compassionate in all communications. This is one of the things that I share with anytime I'm called by a school district to help in an incident. When I ask about what they're doing and what they've done, a sense of the authenticity and is the compassion there. The more we show compassion and the authenticity, the more even those that get angry or will be angry or want to blame us for the incident will understand that we as humans are treating this in the most professional way possible. We will recover a lot quicker. And again, apologize if necessary. And as I said, recognize that all of this is easier said than done. And it's best to have these conversations within your organization before the incident so you're better prepared. One parting thought. Managing any crisis successfully is less about saying the right things and more about doing the right things. Again, it's really important that you act in a way that's authentic, compassionate, but also doing the right thing. I've been often asked, how did you know, Rick, what to do to respond to the Columbine tragedy? And I call it cardiac assessment. I thought about that question long and hard, and over the years, I came up with the terminology cardiac assessment. And what it basically is for me is we did what was right in the heart and the mind. The mind is the experience, the knowledge, and the heart is the skills, and the heart is the one component, the one piece that only we control, and that is that our ability to make the decision on, is it the right thing to do for our families and for our victims and for our community, not for what will look good on a resume or what will count towards that future job, because now I have a good videotape of an interview I did with NBC News or some morning show. So if it was right in the heart for our community, for our organization, that's really what led us through the most difficult days, and what I advise and counsel organizations to think about as they're putting together their communications, key messages, and they're planning for that.